Welcome to Bleach Revisited. I am Karker Gold, your host of this series in which we will be reading the entirety of the Bleach manga, chapter by chapter, providing critical analysis of the art and the narrative, as well as personal response to each of these chapters. We'll also be talking about how they connect to the rest of the series as a whole. So if any of that interests you, you are in the right place. As usual, we will begin the episode with a reading of the chapter that we are on. This is chapter 49, Unchained. It's flowing into me. Is this Kurasaki's spirit energy? Even this battle of spiritual powers, Soul Reapers and Quincy's are completely different. Soul Reapers materialize spirit energy from their own souls into a Zanpakuto. They use the power from within. Quincy's gather random ambient spirits, coat them in their own spirit energy, and materialize them as hollow killing weapons. We use the power from without, so to speak. Just now, when I touched Ichigo's sword, my spirit weapon, Kojaku, the Lone Sparrow, grew more powerful. Unbeknownst to Ichigo, spirit energy poured from his Zanpakuto at my touch. If it flows like that involuntarily... Ichigo, huh? What? Whoa! How did your bow get so big? Shut up and listen. We may be able to defeat him. For real? Bleach, chapter 49, Unchained. Can you see Ishida and Ichigo? Uh-huh. Clearly? Uh-huh. Oh. They're blurry to me. We watch from here. We look and choose the path we'll take. The truth is, I haven't forgotten a single detail, but seeing my brother the monster and Ichigo trying to kill each other, I could easily choose to doubt my memory. Chad, what are we supposed to do? All right, we're ready. Now we can fight him. You're an idiot. What? Get with the program. If you consciously release your spirit energy at maximum output while your sword and I are touching, I should be able to shoot an enormous arrow. Now come on. Control your spirit energy. Let it build up and then release it at maximum output. I've never really controlled my spirit energy before. What? I don't believe it. How do you fight hollows? Instinct, I guess? Instinct? How should I know? Controlling spirit energy means turning it on and off, right? But there's no faucet. How am I supposed to control its flow? If I'm giving off a lot of spirit energy, then maybe it's on full blast all the time? Full blast all the time? Well, that would explain things. But the idea of his spirit energy pouring out of him doesn't seem to bother him? Is he really that stupid? What? His spiritual pressure is rising. A doom blast. Is he going to discharge a doom blast here? Quick, run. If that hits you, there won't be anything left. Run, Ichigo! I knew it. There's no other way. Ready, Ichigo. Touch me with your sword. Again? Ichigo? Hey, jerk. Where are you going? What's he charging in for? Another wild close quarters attack? He fights like a furious child. But he'll never survive this one. Ichigo. Ah! He deflected it? That sound. Sympathetic resonance? And what's this? Abnormal spiritual pressure. Ichigo is accumulating energy? The sound I'm hearing? It's like a giant magnet pulling particles of iron out of the sand. Maybe it's on full blast all the time. Yes, suddenly it all makes sense. No matter how much spirit energy one has, if left to continuously spill out, it all drains away. I never really controlled my spirit energy before. If he can't even control his spirit energy, then he must have an incredible amount to do what he does. If they turn on a faucet and the water gushes out in a torrent, most people would instinctively close the valve. But Ichigo Kurosaki were to do that, if his spirit energy were to be contained, the pressure would skyrocket. Then, if the valve were suddenly opened wide, that is it for Chapter 49 of Bleach. Unchained. Yeah, pretty cool chapter. I, of course, like many of these chapters, I do like it, but I like Bleach, so, you know, am I really unbiased? But let's get into actually talking about the art and the narrative here and how both of them are working. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on that I'd like to touch on. First and foremost, we do get a lot of fantastic moments. So here we can get, immediately that huge bow that we only saw a little bit of in the previous chapter, but, Ishida basically taking in all the spiritual energy that Ichigo is pumping out and creating this large bow. I love that we can see his blood from his fingers flying up into it. Like just the image of his hand here is fantastic. But also, the way that his bow is kind of doubled over and kind of gotten this other shape to it entirely. I think that's kind of cool too. Here we get a very nice close up on the hilt of Ichigo's Zenpakuto. And yeah, of course, he's just sitting down, which is also kind of great. Lots of this internalization. We get a kind of this is the first moment that we really get confirmation. I think especially from Ishida, who has insight into this, which I think I like. I like that a lot. That whenever we finally do have this described, it is coming from Ishida, rather than someone like Urahara or especially Rukia, who's not very familiar with the Quincy. So, I appreciate this from him because Ishida seems like he doesn't have reason to lie about this as an internalization from him, nor does he have any misinformation going on, at least. For at least how the Quincy powers work. Assumably the Shinigami powers are the same way, right? So the idea is that the fundamental difference is that for Shinigami, they have their own spiritual energy that they're releasing, right? And then they pump it into their weapon, their Zanpakuto, or soul cutter, or whatever you want to call it, right? And for the Quincy, they draw in the ambient spirits around them. So like the spiritual energy around them, and then they meld it with their own energy to kind of coax it into a weapon. So this ends up getting translated later as Reishi, the random ambient spirits. But think of it as just like spiritual kind of particulate in the air. Like kind of like how we breathe air, like there's just always oxygen around us. The idea is that, there is this kind of spiritual sort of energy all around us at all times anyway as well. And so that's what Quincy are kind of drawing in their power from. They're drawing in this reishi around them to, meld into their weapons and all of that. I think that's part of why it actually, hurts Ishida to use his weapon, because it's not him just externalizing his power. He's got to actually consecrate this energy. At least that's the way that I tend to read it. But it is cool. It also gives you a very direct, difference in how the two of them use their powers and like the fundamental setup of those powers. I talked a little bit in the last episode of how I think Bleach has a pretty cool power system, and something that doesn't come up a lot because, usually you think of like the mechanics of a power system being able to kind of really easily classify like a bunch of different types of user. Whereas Bleach's power system does that, but not explicitly, if that makes sense. So we get characters like Shinigami and I say characters like we get characters like Ichigo and Uryu who are Shinigami and Quincy respectively, and we get told how their powers work to kind of set up a basis for these different powers. What I kind of wish here is that we got an explanation of hollows as well, though I'm pretty sure that everything that we have currently kind of points towards hollows working the same way that Shinigami do, but not that they put their energy into a Zanpakuto, but that they, it's a part of their actual physical being, um, right? That it enhances them kind of physically rather than being something that's worked into their weapon. So I think like the way that a hollow would essentially be a third kind of designation of how power gets used, rather than externalizing it, this power from it within. It's using in the same way that the Shinigami does this power within to their body itself. That it's less of a conscious kind of thing, but we do see a difference in that later in this chapter. So that's kind of neat. There's some things to think about whenever it comes to the way that powers get used. But I do think it's a consistent system throughout Bleach, and it's a pretty neat one. Anyway, here we do get mention of the name of Uryu's weapon, right? The Kojaku, which is something that I often don't remember. um, is that it's called the Kojaku? I don't remember if that comes up again or not. The Lone Sparrow. It's an interesting name for his bow, but yeah, you gotta wonder if like every Quincy has a unique bow or what, right? But regardless, the idea is that like it's his spirit weapon, right? He doesn't refer to it in kind of generically at all, which is cool. This idea of having, you know, even Uryu, who is a member of the Quincy, limited as they may be, he does say he is the last Quincy. Um, Even so, he still has something kind of unique to him rather than it just being like these Quincy techniques that have been passed to him and they're unique by the fact that there aren't any other Quincy, right? I do like that, we get this kind of serious internalization from Ishida as he's looking down on this weapon that he's holding, which is, Ichigo's sword, and Ichigo is clueless. Is pretty good. Till of course he looks over and sees Ishida with this huge bow. Yeah, just kind of neat. Again, Ishida drawn pretty like looking pretty young in this panel here too. I think really his eyes and expression sell it there. They're not as serious as he usually is. Like here, he has a kind of a much more serious and maybe adult looking expression. He reminds me a lot of one of the kids from not Hunter x Hunter, from Shaman King. There's like the one kid that uses the martial arts spirit that has kind of a similar look to him. He's much younger, at least in the way that he's portrayed. But early Ishida reminds me of that kid a little bit. Anyway, complete aside, just I mean like visually, and it's been a while since I've read Shaman King, so I might be completely off base. But what I mean is that at least here, he's drawn a little bit like more childish looking. I don't know, like a little bit more rounded out. We talked about that before as well. We get a shot of the Minas Grande, and it is, consistently still their enemy, their antagonist. Gonna cough a little. Anyway, we get a very haggard looking Rukia. I guess she's had a rough day. Also, if we remember, she was having trouble with her Gigai in general. We get those power lines. We actually don't get a chapter cover spread that we usually get for this one. Instead, we get the panels kind of cut aside this way, and a very mysterious and smug-looking Urahara. Curious indeed. But I like that this comes, especially the Urahara, comes after like this moment of, Ichigo and Ishida kind of forming this plan. So it certainly kind of speaks towards part of Urahara's goals, right? That he's really interested and invested in them forming the plan. And oh yeah, Rukia is under a binding spell, by the way, too. So there is that a note. Maybe she's under so much duress because of that. Whew. See, I can remember what I've read a day ago. Anyway, so we cut forward, and I love there's like very small details here, but I like that there's still like this shattering of reality kind of happening, and almost like the reality that he's pulled himself into, this Minos, has like it's shredded in these ways, which is kind of interesting. That it's like clinging to it. Um, we get to this bit, and I kind of love this. It's a very small moment, but between Orihime and Chad, where they're just watching. I guess this is the kind of thing that Urahara told them, right? That they can come and see, but they don't have to join in, and they can make the decision themselves. Um, we also get iteration of right? She could see Ichigo and Ishida. They're still blurry to Chad. I think the idea, obviously, Ishida shouldn't be blurry from a spiritual perspective, right? Because, you know, he's a human. I think the idea is they're just far away, right? Which, in a way, speaks towards Orihime being more perceptive in a different way. Maybe Chad just needs glasses. But it is a cool way to, like, remind us of these other characters that are here. But we get a little bit more in this moment where Orihime is really reflecting on this crossroads that they're at, right? That they're going to watch this fight play out, and then they'll choose how they want to get involved. And this is something that Kisuke set up, right? So kind of neat that this has kind of come together finally. Chad's very much thinking about it. We don't even get to see his eyes in this moment, so it's unclear exactly where his mind is on it. I mean, we don't get to see Chad's eyes very often anyway, but I do like just like especially this sequence here, and with Orihime remembering everything about Ichigo and fighting, her brother, right? Here we could see, that she's able to see the assumably this is the Reiatsu, the spiritual energy, kind of flowing off of Ichigo's sword. I don't remember exactly what panel this is calling back to because this might just be dust from something else, but um, nevertheless, I assume that this is a flashback to whenever they were fighting in her house, right? And that's the hole in the side of the house, and this is from her perspective of Ichigo. And so it's kind of neat that she was able to perceive, that much anyway, which is kind of neat, just interesting. But we get the revelation that she never really lost her memory, right? That she kind of rejected it, but whenever it was just a memory that only she had, and it was a troubling one to have, she could choose to doubt it, but now that other people are involved, she can't really deny it anymore. Um, yeah, and I love this moment of real doubt from her, where like she's kind of holding her head low and she's not sure what to do, and she's asking Chad for support, right? And Chad's still himself not sure either. Like both of them are in this again, this kind of real crossroads where they're seeing these people that they care about in danger, and they know that they can be involved in it, but it means that they themselves will have to be involved in that danger even more too, right? And I don't know, it just kind of conveys the situation really well. Um, Not that it's like a hopeless one or anything, but just kind of the anxieties and stress of it. I think we get a lot of really good portrayal of both of these characters, kind of dramatically so. We haven't seen Chad's eye in this like this chapter until this panel where we get him kind of looking aside and being hesitant to respond to Orihime about this, which Chad is also a man of few words anyway. But yeah, fantastic art of Chad on this page in general, but also of Orihime. Just very good expressive kind of ways of drawing these characters in general. And I think also another thing that's worth being said is like we have them high up in this place, but they're looking out this window right into this other world, and so it's like literally they're at this portal to another world and they're glimpsing through it. So in a lot of ways, it's like what Kisuke said is literally true, right? That they can open the door and look through it, and they don't have to pass through. In this case, it's a window, but in a lot of ways, a window is like it's a screen into another world, more or less, or into a reality outside of the kind of comfortable or more comfortable, typically, one that you're in. Um, Sometimes a window, if you're in a dreadful place like a prison or something, it can be a glimpse into some place that's got more freedom for you. Who knows? But windows are often used in that way, and so the idea is that Orihime is both physically and metaphorically at this precipice where she's looking out upon this world that she can be a part of, but she's not sure exactly what she should do. And I think part of that is that you know where if she is to accept this world, if she is to join Ichigo, right? The idea is that she has to accept like the cruel reality of everything that happened to her brother. She can't just continue to reject it or deny it anymore. Whereas, as we've come to learn about Orihime, she is very much the kind of person to sort of just like, I don't know, put on a face or like not lie so much as, neglect unfortunate truths. So, yeah, it's something for her to grow from, certainly. And it's neat that that culminates here and that's reflected here. Anyway, back to a gag moment. Ichigo with the sword strapped onto Ishida's head. Always a pretty funny bit. Yeah, the idea, of course, is that like, well, because his energy is flowing out of him through his sword. If the sword's touching Ishida, then Ishida can absorb that energy and work it into his bow, and then they have a ranged attack that they can hit this enemy with. Bit of an inconsistency here, right? Of course, he has the sword in his head. He's looking over. I love this kind of gag take of him with the sword pointing at Ichigo on top of his head, but of course it's not there in the next panel, which is a shame. I assume that between panels he must have taken it off, as we don't see it wrapped on his head again. I'm pretty sure, but funny nevertheless. But we get this reiteration, and I mean, this is something that's come up before: is that Ichigo kind of doesn't have control over his spiritual energy. That Ichigo is really naive and kind of is learning to be a Soul Reaper in a lot of different ways. And so there's this one thing that he hasn't learned yet is this idea of controlling his energy, right? That's a pretty common trope with any kind of shonen series. Is like, oh, you've got all this power, but you need to learn how to control it. Because usually you think like, okay, how do I make my character powerful, right? How do I make my character capable of overcoming all these odds, but also make it difficult for them? And there's a couple different ways you can do that, right? You can make your character really smart, right? That they're really tactical and they're able to figure out like a creative solution to a problem whenever they don't have just raw physical might. And a lot of really interesting battle manga will do that, where you don't expect the main character to win an up and down fight, but they come up with a clever and inventive way to defeat their enemy, even if they are a strong character, right? I think that's maybe one of the things that I feel is missing the most from A lot of the later parts of a lot of series like DBZ or Naruto, where you lose a little bit of that inventiveness because characters have become so strong that it's just a clash of straight on power, and there isn't as much of that like kind of struggle there, or that need to kind of invent or you know strategize. I don't know. Um, but yeah, that's one way. The other big one, and this is one that we will see more often in Bleach, is we have these characters and they have to figure out how to deal with either you know the fight at hand, where they have to solve some sort of way of dealing with their immediate enemy. In a lot of ways, this is similar to strategizing, but it's just kind of like the breakthrough sort of, right? It's not so much like, oh, I've come up with a super clever thing of my own. It's more like, oh, I've realized what your weakness is, or I realize how this enemy operates, and so it gives a little bit of an insight into the enemy, and maybe highlights one of their flaws. We'll see that a lot in Bleach, where a character will have like some sort of breakthrough in how the other character fights whenever they're on these one-on-one sort of matches. Um, but then we also have other moments, right? Like where our character just needs to learn how to use their powers effectively. So it's kind of like the reverse breakthrough moment, where the enemy understands exactly how main character is kind of not applying themselves, and the main character finds a way to apply their strength effectively, in a way that surprises the enemy. And so here, the idea is that, like, well, Ichigo's got all this power, but he doesn't know how to control it, and so maybe knowing how to control it will give him moments in which he can surprise or overcome an enemy in ways that he couldn't before. But yeah, you'll notice that almost every shonen will either give the character a bunch of power, then the real trial is like, well, they have to learn how to control it, or they have some other shortcomings, so they can't just use their power straight up. Um, or you have the flip side of it, where they aren't very powerful, but they have to because of that work in all these strategies or be very smart, right? It's rare that we get the ones that are the different, that are entirely just like main characters, just a powerful badass and just wrecks everything. Um, that certainly is the case with stuff like Fist of the North Star, and some parts of JoJo's as well. Though JoJo's has plenty of like figuring out the opponent, right? Those revelatory kind of moments, or strategic moments even as well. So yeah, there's a good bit of all of that in shonen battle manga, and I wouldn't say any one type is better than the other, but I mean, the idea is that if you want to put your character through a bunch of fights, it's like, well, how do we have them make those fights a little bit more interesting? How do we develop the character, uh, power wise from point A to point B, so we can tell kind of interesting things. Anyway, total aside there about kind of more general writing stuff, but the idea is Ichigo definitely falls in the camp of, he doesn't know stuff. He has this power, but he doesn't know how to wield it, right? And we get this analogy of, that he like where Ishida established it kind of, like, hey, you can control your energy. How do you control it? And Ichigo, I say Ishida establishes it, but really Ichigo makes the connection where he's like, yeah, like turning it on and off, or like adjusting the flow of my power. Like, it's not like there's a faucet on it, right? Like there's no adjuster. It's either it's just on full blast like all the time, right? Um, and so Ishida has this moment where he's like, is he stupid? Why doesn't it bother him? And then he realizes it must be that Ichigo is just you know got so much energy that he can constantly pour it out. That pouring out this much energy at all times doesn't wipe him out, right? Even though it would somebody else, because he naturally just produces that much. We get this really cool moment where Ishida feels something that I don't think Ichigo does really, where a shadow is cast over him and he looks straight back to this hollow, and then there's just kind of clicking, as its spiritual pressure is rising, and that's another term that we haven't really gotten but the idea of like there being a pressure that you exert upon others. We get another early weird translation, Doom Blast. This is almost certainly a Sero, which if you're familiar with Bleach, you almost certainly know what a Sero is. But a Sero is like this shot of energy that a hollow can fire, right? We see that first here from this Minos Grande, it firing this Sero. But it seems like early on, they didn't want to just call it a Sero for whatever reason, which Sero is it's just zero. It's just zero. Pretty sure it's just the word zero in Spanish, which you translate that and it's like, yeah, like, well, what are you gonna say, like a zero? Is he gonna discharge his zero? And it's like that doesn't make any sense, right? Um, so it. I guess the idea is that they kind of took the context, realized that it was a blast of energy, and they called it a doom blast. Not great translation, as in the original, in the Japanese, it's just called a Sero, assumably. I don't have the Japanese text in front of me, but I gotta assume that they just called it a Sero in the Japanese, Sero, using Romanji to describe it. I'd have to actually look up the chapter in Japanese to know for sure. But I assume that the Japanese doesn't call it Doom Blast. I'm assuming it calls it a Sero because that's what they end up being called throughout the series. So whatever the translator was like came across that instead of realizing that should have just been kept as a proper name for a thing. They went with this kind of strange, like, oh well, we'll just call it what it literally is, which is a weird take to go with it because Zanpakuto, does have a translation, but we get it called a Zanpakuto earlier, right? We get this kind of proper foreign name for the thing. But here, we get Doom Blast. So it's a bit of a strange moment in translation because, like I said, these are going to be called Sero moving forward at some point. But Doom Blast it is, huh, Viz? Anyway, yes. So the Minos, unlike what we get from the Hollows, right? It can fire this Sero, which is pretty significant. I like that we get this really serious moment from Ichigo as he's like gulping at this oncoming attack, but he's ready to face it head on. Ishida wants to shoot the bow. I think this is another cool moment for kind of both of these characters, that Ishida has this whole, like, oh, we have this paddle, this strategy, I'm going to fire the bow, we're going to take it down before he can do this, right? And Ichigo is much on the other side. He's like, I've got to go in and I've got to intercept this attack because if I don't, we'll all die. But yeah, the idea that he'll never survive this. He fights like a furious child. All of that. There's a bit that Ichigo said earlier that I think is fantastic, where he's like, it's just instinct, right? And I think that really highlights the difference between Ichigo and Ishida, where Ishida, whenever he fights, it's all these techniques that he has, that he's employing technique, and it's a lot of very conscious things, right? He talks about using the spirit threads and having this awareness and so on and so forth. Whereas Ichigo is very much this, like, I'm going to fight based off instinct. I have this feeling, and I'm going to react to it and rely on it. That it just makes sense to him to be in the moment for the fight, right? And that highlights the differences, right? Ishida sees that as like, oh, he's like a furious child, whereas Ichigo sees all of Ishida's kind of techniques and nonsense as maybe being a little bit too trained or practiced or whatever, unable to adapt. Perhaps we don't really get a lot of Ichigo's insight on that yet, but it's a neat moment and difference, and certainly in establishing Ishida as different from Ichigo. And I think their outfits here certainly help to sell it. Where we get Ishida in the the tucked in shirt with the tie and the slacks, um, and Ichigo's in the Shinigami robes, right? Highlights again this kind of extreme difference in their approach. Um, but yeah, kind of cool. I mean, another kind of interesting thing about that is, we get that bit about hollows, right? That they become just like a raging mass of instinct. And so, in a lot of ways, Ichigo clashing against these hollows, he maybe even has more in line with hollows than he does with Shinigami, even, which is an interesting thing to think about, right? If he's just relying surely on his fighting instinct, which is a thing that I'm sure that you could probably apply. We don't have a lot of really basis for Shinigami, but we do know that the Soul Reapers, and whenever I say Shinigami, I mean Soul Reapers. I use those interchangeably, but we know that Soul Reapers have an academy, right? And that Rukia is trained in all this, spell casting. So there's at least this idea of regimen and of like strategy and all of that. There's got to be. There's institutionalized sort of teaching how to fight. So it's not just like, oh well, here have a Zanpakuto and go for it. um, so there's certainly, I think Ichigo is an outlier whenever it comes to Shinigami and the way that he is very instinctual in how he fights, and that's pretty cool. Love this moment where it charges up the Sero and like its face gets all kind of dramatically lit. That's great. And then blast Ichigo. And then, of course, we get him blocking it with his sword in a kind of amazing way. It's like riveting off everywhere. One thing that I really love is, I don't know that this analogy comes back super well, but like this idea of sympathetic resonance, right? Um, the idea that, there's this sort of resonance between Ichigo's energy and the energy of the Sero. So this abnormal spiritual pressure, right? So again, we're getting spiritual pressure once again. So kind of interesting is, Ishida felt this extreme spiritual pressure whenever the Minos was going to fire its Sero at Ichigo, or well, at all of them. And then as Ichigo is building up to redirect that back at the Minos, we get again this extreme spiritual pressure. And we've seen moments of like that extreme pressure kind of be drawn this way before. I think there's like the moment in the very first chapter, right? Whenever Rukia goes outside of Ichigo's room and finally feels the pressure of the hollow that's nearby, and she's like, "Oh, geez, how did I not even realize this?" And realizes it's because she was in the same room as Ichigo, and his pressure was like drowning its out in a way, kind of just normally. It was kind of interesting to think about in that line of that was already a moment of Ichigo's kind of abnormal spiritual pressure being put on display. But here, yeah, he's accumulating his own energy. He's building up his own energy. Um, and there's this interesting bit of like this sound like a magnet pulling particles of iron out of the sand. I think the idea with like this resonance and him accumulating this energy and he's pulling this energy. There's a couple different ways you can read that, and I think the simplest one is right that Ichigo is sort of digging deep to pull out these reserves of his own energy, um, and like letting them all loose. And we maybe get a little bit of insight here, right, where he thinks about, or he was considering what Ichigo said about it being on full blast all the time. And he's like, well, no matter how much spiritual energy he has, you leave it on, it's all going to drain away eventually. And so he must have just a lot if he can keep it on, right? Yeah. if Ichigo Kurosaki were to do that, if his spirit energy were to be contained, the pressure would skyrocket. The idea being that, like, he has so much energy flowing through him, if he were to stop it from flowing out, the pressure would go up really, really highly, like it is right now. So, I think the idea, and I love this moment of Ishida having this realization about Ichigo and his powers, and Ichigo having this, just really cool, dramatically lit moment. I love the shadows on his robe here, how this is done with the ink, as well as just the shading across his face. Pretty good stuff. Not the cleanest. We get parts of like lines going outside of the lines of the face, but it works for this kind of dramatic, rough moment. And the idea being like, okay, well, if he has all of that pressure, and then he suddenly kind of releases it, uh, you know, it could cause a huge reaction like this. So, yeah, we get the final kind of slash to defeat this Minos, right? To send this arc of power up its body, which is pretty cool. And then we get this art of, this thing without so it's like the spigot or the faucet without having its, adjuster on it, whatever you would call that. I guess the faucet itself. Oh boy, parts of a faucet. Help me out here. Um, yeah, you know, yeah, I couldn't tell you exactly what you would call that. The thing that bevels into it. Anyway, so what I'm saying is there are a couple ways that you can interpret this. I think the thing on page is essentially like, well, okay, Ichigo has all this energy that he's constantly letting go out of him. So were he to like hold a little bit of it back, it would build up a lot of pressure, and then he would release a lot at once, right? Um, in a lot of ways, that's sort of what the Sero is that the Hollow did, right? That it kind of built up all this pressure into one place and then released it all at once as this big blast. So there's an interesting kind of link there between exactly what the Minos is doing and what Ichigo is doing, redirecting that blast back at it. Um, Kind of wild. But then the other thing that I think is kind of going on here that's important, I don't know exactly, what we can talk about with like sympathetic resonance, right? Because whenever you think about something resonating, it's you know in relation to another thing, kind of moving in the same way, right? Especially think about sound waves having resonance, right? Both of them kind of end up resonating with each other, and the sounds coming together. Sympathetic being, this other sort of thing that you can relate to. And so I wonder if here this is meant to be, again, a connection between the sort of release of energy that the Hollow has and the release of energy that Ichigo ends up having right here as well. And I think there's also these, if we come back to what Ishida was saying about, drawing upon the spiritual power, like the Reiatsu, right? The spiritual power of something. That in a lot of ways, Ichigo might be, pulling in all of this power that's directed at him and then redirecting it back. It's unclear, right? So like, there's a couple ways that you can read this. I think most literal one on page, of course, is that Ichigo is able to, because he's so powerful, he's able to block this attack, and then he's able to direct it back through, kind of lowering his own spiritual energy, letting its pressure build up, and then releasing it back upon the Hollow. That said, there's something else sort of maybe going on here, having Ichigo maybe having this sympathetic resonance and, doing something that's very similar to kind of what the Hollow did, right? Having this moment of, building up its energy and then having a real release of spiritual pressure and then shooting back this like large attack. So there's this connection to the Hollow, which we already drew a connection earlier whenever we're talking about Ichigo just fighting on instincts. So maybe Ichigo has more in common with Hollows than we had thought. But there's also, this idea of Ichigo pulling this energy from external to himself, right? If Shinigami are meant to just pull their own energy all the time, then is he resonating with this energy external to himself and pulling it and using it? But if that's something that Quincy does, then how is Ichigo doing it? So it raises a couple of questions. I think the ultimate takeaway here is that this is just Ichigo doing something incredibly insane and powerful, and is really like him having a moment of, shutting off his energy for a little bit and then building up a lot of pressure and releasing it. So he's learning in this act, this do or die act. He's really learning a little bit of what it means to control his spiritual power. So that's cool, right? That this idea of control gets brought up in this chapter, and Ichigo gets to exhibit that and use it in a very powerful way. Again, whenever I talked about in the previous chapter, I wish there was a little bit more to kind of illustrate those moments that I thought could be better illustrated. There are really nice illustrations here to kind of show. I love that we get all of this water kind of draining. We still get a couple of blank panels, and I wish that we got something more there. Also, Ishida really teases out this, like, if Ichigo were to do that, his spiritual energy were to be contained, the pressure would skyrocket. Then the valve would suddenly be opened wide, and then I don't get to finish my sentence. So it's like it takes like it's like a four page payoff for this idea that starts at the bottom of one, and really kind of builds up to that. So that one doesn't work as well for me. Maybe it does a little bit better for you, but nevertheless, I still like it. I still think it's a cool moment. I just wish that maybe it was a little bit snappier. I think we could have done with just like a really effective having panels to show this moment, and then snapping to the next page of him throwing the energy up the Minos' body. But I do love the art that we get here of this revelation on Ishida's part, and this very determined look on Ichigo's as he, directs his energy forward. Lots of really great, Ichigo here with the sword in the air, and then also this kind of swinging down moment. Really cool. I love all of that. So, we get yet another kind of cool Ichigo moment, neat moment in the chapter on. As always, I really do love the art in this. I think we get a lot of great expressions from all the characters in ways that we really haven't before. Lots of ways of seeing these characters in a new light and from new perspectives. I mean that literally and figuratively. We also get a little bit more of Ishida too, because that's one interesting thing about this whole chapter that I didn't mention yet. But so much of this is from Ishida's perspective, and that's not something that we've really gotten earlier in this manga or before. And I think that playing with perspective is something that we'll see a little bit more in Bleach as we go forward. For the most part, we've really focused on just having moments of Ichigo or Rukia's. Well, I don't even know how much from Rukia's perspective. A little bit. It's mostly from Ichigo's perspective. We've had small moments, of course, from Chad's or from Orihime's. And we got a little bit of Orihime's perspective, I guess both Orihime and Chad, but we were kind of sitting with her internalizations, right? So it's interesting that we get a kind of major chapter shift where almost all the chapters coming from Ishida, because before now, his perspective was very external to what we were getting. So it's neat that we got that. We still, of course, the way that you can kind of keep characters more interesting, or I guess more mysterious, is you can keep their perspective hidden. So we obviously haven't gotten one from Kisuke's perspective, right? So yeah, we're getting more insights into Ishido, which is nice, and we're getting to really spend time in his mind or with his thoughts on things, which helps to align us to him, which helps us to see him as, maybe one more of the protagonist than an antagonist. Which he's certainly situated as an antagonist early on. He's in the shadows. He's watching Ichigo. He's confronting him. All of that. But here we finally get to see him used a little bit better, or I guess I say not better, but used as a protagonist and from his perspective for a majority of the chapter. So it's a nice switch, and I think it happens pretty seamlessly. So much so that I almost forgot to talk about it. But yeah, cool chapter. Love the art. I like how this all sort of comes together. I wish there was a little bit more interaction with the Minos Grande. I mean, it kind of shows up, kicks the shit out of Ichigo, and then is like, okay, well, I'm going to fire a Sarah. I guess it eats a couple of hollows. Um, but yeah, I always wish there was a little bit more going on with it than what we got. Because we have these kind of intricate fights with the other hollows, at least, the major kind of chapter hollows before. So I would have loved to see a little bit more of the abilities it has, but I think this is kind of more of a generic showcasing of what a Minos class hollow can do, right? The Minos Grande and what it's capable of, right? That it devours other hollows, and it's the amalgamation of thousands of hollows, and it can fire these Doom Blast Ceros and all that, and it can just kick the ever living crap out of you too. Anyway, let's talk about how this connects to the rest of Bleach. Let's talk about spoilers, and there are a few. Of course, this idea of using the spiritual pressure from somebody else to power up your Quincy techniques is something that we never see again. No, obviously, Yuha Bach uses, he just literally stills other people's powers. And so this idea of taking power from an external source and using it, being the Quincy's whole thing, it's kind of interesting thinking about that connected to Bach, right? That he hands out all this power, that he spreads out his power, and then he's able to take it back into himself. And so it's neat that Quincy have a power system that emulates that to an extent, that they take this power external to themselves and then they use it. Um, yeah, kind of neat. I mentioned it again, the idea of unique Quincy bows. We do get that. Yoshida gets a lot of different bow designs. I wonder if they're all technically Kujaku or Kojaku, but if he gets a different name for his, and I just forgot the fact that he would say that they had a different name. I mean, obviously, I can remember whenever he uses the Scylla Schneider, but there are other moments with different bows that I'm curious about. And clearly, his father has a different bow from him, and the bows that all the Sternritter use are unique as well. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. He says my spirit weapon too. So the idea, of course, Quincy used bows. I think more nebulously, Quincy used spiritual weapons that are ranged, and the whole point is that they don't want to engage in melee with a hollow because they don't want to get poisoned by the hollow Rietsu. So it's cool that here we get this distinction of spirit weapon, rather than like my bow. There's nothing exactly like Quincy only used bow, though I do believe that it is something like that is kind of famously the line whenever he uses the Scylla Schneider, right, and fires it as an arrow. He's like, Quincy only used bows. Whereas we come to find that's hardly the case with the Sternritter otherwise. Anyway, neat nevertheless that we have this talk about how these powers work. I like the idea that, again, Soul Reapers materialize their own spiritual energy from their souls and either, direct them into a Zanpakuto or kind of direct them into Kido and stuff, right? And so that's kind of interesting to think about, you know, obviously Ichigo is this hybrid, so he's able to use his spiritual energy to enhance himself, to push out into his weapon like this, and then also to draw in from around him. And I think ultimately that's kind of what's happening here the with the Minas Grande, right? Anyway, that's the other big connection. Obviously, trying to think about if there's any of this other stuff that connects. Also trying to stifle yawns. Been up a bit late as of this recording. I think that's the idea that the Getsuga Tensho is kind of control of spiritual energy is neat. That Ichigo actually does learn a little bit of technique and control. I wish that there was more of that, but you can only get so much, I guess. Especially for a character like Ichigo, who isn't exactly the kind of tactical type in the first place. Be harder to buy. But yeah, interesting that Rukia. So Rukia's understanding of Minos is from just like storybooks, right? That like she essentially studied about these, but she's never encountered one on her own. So it's neat that she knows about Sero as well. That like that would have been something that she learned, and of course the power of it. I like that also we get the mention of spiritual pressure, especially before the Sero is fired. Also really neat. Um, I'm trying to really think about like this moment, especially this particular, especially whenever he starts talking about this sort of sympathetic resonance and Ichigo really like accumulating this energy that's being fired at him, because we just have it established that Quincy drawing the energy around them, and I can't help but figure that is a little bit of what's going on here. That it's not just Ichigo, building up his energy and then releasing it from being like high pressure at the right moment, but instead that there's some Quincy shenanigans going on. I don't know. Let me know what you think with that, with the whole, especially the idea of sympathetic resonance and the idea of, a giant magnet pulling particles of iron out of the sand. Because I think that all points towards Ichigo doing more of a Quincy thing here than a Shinigami thing. But I'm not exactly positive because, like I said, the clearest reading just makes it obvious that like, oh well, he built up a little bit of that pressure and now he's releasing it. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there's really anything else to connect to across this chapter. Obviously, this big slash that gets done, we can really relate it to a Getsuga in a lot of ways, even though it's not called one here. But otherwise, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there's really that much else in the way of connection. If you can find any, go ahead and comment on this video. Let me know. As always, make sure that you let people know that you are commenting something with spoilers so that no one gets spoiled. But otherwise, that's it for this episode. That's it for this discussion of this chapter, chapter 49, Unchained. Thank you so much for following along with Bleach Revisited. I really enjoy making this series, and I enjoy all of the kind of views and comments that y'all give me. So, excited to see, also, of course, for myself, where Bleach goes and all the other moments that come up. But, as always, this has been Karaka Gold, reminding you that spirits are forever with you. Stay gold.